On a wide tree-lined thoroughfare in Brooklyn, where the rhythm of New York City softens into a steady residential hum, stands the house at 2230 Ocean Parkway. It is a solid, unpretentious structure of red brick, 3 stories tall, with a tidiness that speaks of quiet suburban life. It does not demand attention. It is designed then and now to be overlooked, to melt into the background of a neighborhood that values its privacy. Today, sunlight filters through the leaves of mature sycamores, dappling the facade in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The lawn is neatly trimmed, the windows are clean, and there is nothing to suggest that this home is anything other than what it appears to be: a sanctuary for a family, a node in a peaceful community, a piece of ordinary American real estate. Its normality is its most profound and unsettling feature. This very ordinariness is the ruin, not a ruin of crumbling walls and shattered glass, but a ruin of memory, a deliberate erasure of a terrifying legacy. The power that once radiated from this address, a power that could halt commerce on the nation's busiest docks and decide matters of life and death across a continent, has been paved over, painted, and re-landscaped into oblivion. The fortress has been dismantled from the inside out, its purpose hollowed, its history muted. The house offers no clues. There is no plaque on the wall, no mention in local guidebooks. It has been sold and resold, its deed passing through hands that may know nothing of the whispers embedded in its foundations. New layers of paint cover the original plaster. New carpets muffle the floors where men of immense and dangerous stature once walked. It is a ghost, hiding in plain sight, a monument to an invisible empire now rendered invisible itself. One might look at the windows of the upper floors, seeing only the reflection of the sky or the passing traffic. Yet these same panes of glass once served as the eyes of a king, a vantage point from which a silent monarch observed his domain. The entire neighborhood was his surveillance system, a web of loyalists and informants disguised as neighbors, ensuring that no threat could approach unseen. Today, those windows reflect only the mundane. The front door, now likely open for deliveries or to welcome guests to a child's birthday party, was once a threshold between two worlds. To cross it was to enter the court of Carlo Gambino, the most powerful and enigmatic crime boss in American history. It was a portal into a reality governed by its own unforgiving laws, a place where loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and silence was the highest virtue. Deep beneath the main floor lies a basement. In its current form, it might be a recreation room, a laundry area, or a space for storage. But this subterranean level was once the true seat of power, a soundproofed sanctum sanctorum where the fate of the American Mafia was debated and decided. It was a corporate boardroom and a tribunal, a place where fortunes were made and death sentences were issued with quiet, paternalistic finality. The silence that now envelops the property is of a different quality than the silence that once defined it. The old silence was heavy, charged with unspoken threats and absolute authority. It was the calculated quiet of a predator. The new silence is simply emptiness, the absence of the immense gravitational will that once held an entire criminal underworld in its orbit. The house itself seems complicit in this forgetting. It has accepted its new identity with a stoicism befitting its former master. It does not betray the secrets it holds. The scent of Sunday barbecues has replaced the cold tension of clandestine meetings. The sound of children's laughter has echoed away the hushed tones of conspiracy. This transformation is the ultimate testament to the ephemeral nature of power built on fear. An empire that once seemed as permanent as the city's bedrock has vanished, leaving behind only this brick shell, this architectural ghost. The structure remains, but the institution it housed has collapsed into history, its influence scattered like dust. The wind that blows down Ocean Parkway seems to carry no memory of the black cars that once idled at the curb, or the men in dark suits who came and went with deferential purpose. The street, the trees, the very air itself seemed to have conspired to forget the king who ruled from this modest suburban throne. And so, the house stands as the final paradox of a man who mastered the art of invisibility. Its current anonymity is the most haunting echo of his reign. It forces a question not of what remains, but of what was ever truly there. How did this unassuming brick house become the silent capital of American crime, Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside few dared to know, and what those walls concealed is a story of power so vast it required no palace to announce it. To understand the man, one must first understand the fortress he disguised as a home. Subscribe to see the stories of empires built in the shadows and the architecture of their inevitable fall. Before the house on Ocean Parkway was a fortress, it was an idea, born not in the mind of an architect, but in the memory of a boy from Cacamo, Sicily. This was a land of silent hills and ancient codes, where power was communicated through whispers and glances, and where the most dangerous man was often the one who seemed the most humble. Carlo Gambino was a product of this landscape, a place that taught him early that visibility was a vulnerability, and silence a weapon. He carried this lesson across the Atlantic, a piece of old-world wisdom that would shape the destiny of the New World's underworld. He did not arrive in America through the grand hall of Ellis Island, but as a stowaway, an invisible man slipping into the country's bloodstream. From his first moments on American soil, his existence was a clandestine one. He melted into the growing Italian enclaves of New York, a city that in the age of Prohibition was a cauldron of ambition and violence. He was young, but he was a patient observer, watching the rise and fall of men who mistook notoriety for power. He saw the swagger of gangsters who craved the spotlight, their names splashed across tabloid headlines. They built empires of booze and blood, and they lived in opulent mansions that announced their success to the world and to their enemies. Gambino watched them burn brightly and then extinguish, brought down by a rival's bullet or a federal indictment. He learned what not to do. He understood that a throne built in the public eye was merely a target. His own ascent was a study in deliberate motionlessness. Within the crime family, then headed by Vincent Mangano, he was a quiet earner, a reliable soldier who displayed none of the flamboyant ambition of his peers. He did not seek attention, and so he did not attract it. While others built reputations on acts of spectacular violence, he built his on a foundation of quiet competence and strategic patience. He was not building a legend. He was building a network. The man who ruled his world was Albert Anastasia, a figure of pure, terrifying force. Known as the Lord High Executioner, Anastasia was the embodiment of explosive, unpredictable power. He was a storm, and Gambino was the calm at its edge, studying its patterns, waiting for it to exhaust itself. It was in the shadow of this brutal reign that Gambino's own vision of power, and the architecture that would contain it, began to solidify. His dream was not of a sprawling Long Island estate or a marble-clad Manhattan penthouse. Such places were for men who needed to prove their power to others. Gambino's ambition was different. He sought a power so absolute, so deeply embedded in the fabric of the city that it required no announcement. He envisioned a command center that did not look like one, a nerve center that was functionally invisible. This vision led him to Brooklyn, not to an isolated corner, but to the heart of his territory, Ocean Parkway. To live there was not a retreat from the world, but a strategic insertion into its very center. He would not rule from a distant castle, but from a command post hidden in plain sight, surrounded by the men who owed him their loyalty and their lives. The neighborhood would not be a backdrop to his power, it would be an extension of it. And so, the house at 2230 was chosen, a solid, respectable, three-story brick home. It was an act of profound psychological camouflage. Its very normality was its genius. In a world of predators who puffed up their chests to appear larger, Gambino chose the protective coloring of the suburban patriarch. The house was a declaration that he was not one of them. He was something older, quieter, and far more dangerous. This choice was born of a deep, disciplined paranoia. Gambino understood that the true threat was not the rival gangster, but the systematic gaze of the federal government. The FBI could tap a phone, follow a car, and raid a gaudy mansion. But how could they lay siege to a house that looked identical to every other on the block? A home from which a quiet old man emerged each Sunday for church. The house was a physical rejection of the entire mythology of the American gangster. It was a statement of intent. The business he was in was not about spectacle. It was about control. The house on Ocean Parkway was to be the corporate headquarters of an invisible empire, and its architecture had to reflect the corporate philosophy. Efficiency, discretion, and absolute authority masked by a veneer of quiet respectability. Every element of the property was a reflection of the man. The unadorned brick facade mirrored his own austere, unreadable expression. The deep foundations suggested a power that was permanent, rooted and unshakable. Its location, embedded within a community, spoke to his mastery of human intelligence networks over technological ones. The house was his autobiography, written in mortar and wood. It was also the perfect stage for his carefully constructed persona of the paternalistic elder. It was a family home, a place where his grandchildren could play in the yard, where his wife could tend her garden. This image of domestic tranquility was his most powerful alibi, a human shield that concealed the cold, calculating mind that directed a national conspiracy from the basement below. Gambino was not just building a home, he was building a dynasty. The house was conceived as its permanent seat, a St. Peter's Basilica for a faith of fear and loyalty. It was meant to project a sense of permanence, to be the quiet center of a universe that would long outlive its creator. It was a fortress designed not to repel armies, but to withstand time itself. To secure this fortress, he began to subtly reshape the world around it. He populated the neighborhood with his own blood and his most trusted allies. Brothers, cousins, and capos bought homes on the surrounding blocks. The mailman, the butcher, the local beat cop, all were woven into a web of surveillance and allegiance. The entire community became the mansion's outer walls. The house, therefore, was never just a building. It was an instrument of power, meticulously designed and deployed. Its purpose was to deceive, to lull, to misdirect. It allowed a king to live like a commoner, all while holding the power of life and death over a kingdom that stretched from the docks of Red Hook to the shores of California. As the family moved in and the routines of suburban life began to mask the operations within, the project was complete. A home had been built, but a far more complex structure had been erected along with it, the physical manifestation of an idea. The idea that true power needs no monuments, that the greatest empire is the one that no one knows is there, ruled from a throne that no one can see. With the fall of Albert Anastasia in a Manhattan barbershop, a tremor ran through the American underworld, and a new gravity began to emanate from 2230 Ocean Parkway. The house was no longer merely a home. Its purpose shifted, its walls absorbing the weight of a newly consolidated empire. The quiet suburban residence began its silent transformation into the command center of the most powerful criminal organization in the country, its evolution mirroring the ascent of its master. The first fortifications were not of steel or concrete, but of flesh and blood. As Gambino's influence solidified, the neighborhood around the house was methodically colonized. Trusted capos, cousins, and loyal soldiers were encouraged to purchase homes on the surrounding blocks, creating a perimeter of watchful eyes. The street itself became the first line of defense, a human surveillance grid more effective than any camera or alarm system. Every conquest of the empire sent ripples back to this epicenter. When the Gambino family seized absolute control of the Brooklyn waterfront, a new kind of silence descended upon the house. The flow of smuggled goods and stolen cargo was a distant roar, but on Ocean Parkway, the only evidence was a deepening of the quiet, a sense of insulation from the chaotic city that funded its tranquility. The house was a bubble of order in a world of crime. The architecture of deceit was now fully weaponized. The modest brick facade, the neatly trimmed lawn, the unassuming front door, these were no longer just choices of personal taste, but instruments of strategic misdirection. The house projected an image of such profound normality that it repelled suspicion. It was a mask, worn not just by a man, but by an entire institution, allowing it to operate in the open, unseen. Inside, however, the spoils of this invisible war began to accumulate. While the exterior remained unchanged, the interior spaces were gradually enriched with the quiet signifiers of immense wealth. Heavy mahogany furniture imported from the old country filled the rooms. Persian rugs, thick and dark, muffled every footstep, absorbing sound and secrecy. The luxury was private, meant not for display but for the personal comfort of a king who had no need to impress his subjects. This duality defined the property's existence. On the main floor, the rhythms of domestic life played out with convincing authenticity. The smell of simmering tomato sauce would drift from a modern kitchen, and family photographs lined the mantelpiece. But this scene was a carefully maintained stage set, a theatrical production designed to conceal the operations taking place just one level below in the subterranean heart of the empire. The basement was the house's secret. It was not a damp, unfinished cellar, but a fully realized corporate suite paneled in wood and soundproofed. It was here, in this insulated chamber, that the true business of the Gambino family was conducted. This was the sanctum, the place where the outside world, with its laws and its prying eyes, ceased to exist. Here the legendary sit-downs took place. Under the soft glow of recessed lighting, disputes were settled. Territories were divided and fates were decided. These were not the chaotic meetings of cinematic gangsters, but somber, methodical proceedings conducted with the cold formality of a corporate board meeting. Gambino would preside from a simple armchair, a quiet arbiter whose soft-spoken words carried the weight of life and death. The decisions made in that basement radiated outward, shaping the city above. The infiltration of the garment district, the control of construction unions, the vast networks of loan sharking and illegal gambling, all were managed from this single hidden point of control. Tribute, the lifeblood of the organization, flowed not in suitcases of cash to the house itself, but in pledges of loyalty and percentages of earnings accounted for in the quiet of this room. Even the social gatherings in the world above were extensions of this power. The backyard barbecues held on summer afternoons were not simple family affairs. They were political summits disguised as celebrations. To be invited was a summons, an opportunity for Gambino to assess the loyalty of his men, to gauge their ambition, and to communicate his authority through a gesture or a private word away from the grill. These events reinforced the house's role as a psychological fortress. Within its perimeter, Gambino was in total control of the narrative. He was the benevolent patriarch, the respected elder, the man of honor. This performance, staged against the backdrop of a family home, was his most formidable weapon, disarming both allies and enemies, and making the cold calculus of his power seem almost paternal. The physical space of the neighborhood became an extension of the house's authority. The local baker who saved the best bread, the butcher who provided the choicest cuts, the beat cop who saw nothing, all were part of the ecosystem of control. The house did not need high walls or armed guards because its defenses were woven into the community, a network of obligation, fear, and respect. This absence of overt security was the ultimate expression of Gambino's power. It announced that his authority was so absolute, so uncontested, that it required no visible enforcement. The house stood open, yet impenetrable. It was a paradox, a center of immense power that looked like a place of utter vulnerability, a testament to a man who understood that true security lay not in what could be seen, but in what was deeply understood. As the empire grew, the house seemed to draw deeper into itself. It became a repository of secrets, its very atmosphere thick with unspoken knowledge. It was a place where generations of a criminal dynasty were raised, where children played in the yard, oblivious to the conspiracies being hatched in the basement beneath their feet. The structure was complicit in this compartmentalization, holding the two realities separate but together. The property was a direct reflection of its owner's mind, disciplined, orderly on the surface, with a deep, hidden core of ruthless strategy. It was a physical manifestation of his philosophy of power. That which is most powerful is that which is least perceived. The house did not shout, it whispered, and its whisper could silence the city. Each brick and window pane served this singular purpose. The windows did not look out upon the world so much as they allowed the master to observe his immediate domain, ensuring no unexpected vehicle or unfamiliar face went unnoticed. The front door was a checkpoint, a threshold separating the mundane world from the inner sanctum. The house grew not in size but in density, in meaning. With every successful racket and every eliminated rival, its foundations seemed to settle more firmly into the Brooklyn soil. It became an institution in itself, the permanent seat of a government that operated in the shadows. It was the quiet, unmoving center of a violent and chaotic universe. This was the peak of its function. The house was a weapon that looked like a shield. It was a mask that concealed the face of an empire, and for the man inside, it was the ultimate refuge, a psychological bunker where he was insulated from the consequences of his actions and the dangers of the world he commanded. It was a masterpiece of criminal architecture, not of design, but of purpose. It solved the fundamental problem of the underworld king, how to wield absolute power without becoming a target. The house on Ocean Parkway was the answer. An equation of brick, mortar, and fear. Luxury was present, but it was the luxury of total control, of perfect insulation. Was his true vanity reflected in the hidden fineries, the imported objects that only he and his inner circle would ever see? Or was it in the very fabric of the neighborhood, an entire community bent to his will, serving as an invisible moat around his suburban castle? The question of what best symbolized his pride, the secret treasure or the public illusion, remains a subject of debate for those who study the architecture of power. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. The reign of Carlo Gambino was a masterpiece of silence. From the outside, 2230 Ocean Parkway was an island of perfect suburban calm. The world saw a quiet patriarch tending to his garden, a man who had seemingly retired from the olive oil import business to enjoy his golden years. This image was the empire's greatest asset, a carefully constructed fiction that allowed the most powerful criminal in America to operate in plain sight, shielded by the profound invisibility of the ordinary. Inside those brick walls, however, a different reality unfolded. The house was not a home that happened to be the residence of a crime boss. It was the central processing unit of a corporate entity of immense scale and complexity. It was the quiet, unmoving eye of a hurricane of extortion, corruption, and violence that churned across the nation. The tranquility was not an absence of activity, but the product of its perfect, frictionless execution. Power did not arrive at the front door in armored cars or with armed escorts. It came deferentially, in the form of trusted capos and lieutenants who drove unremarkable sedans and parked discreetly down the block. They came not with suitcases of cash, such vulgar displays were forbidden, but with reports, updates, and pledges of fealty. The house was not a vault. It was a throne room, and tribute was paid in the form of information and absolute obedience. The true currency of this kingdom was control, and its lifeblood was a constant, invisible torrent of wealth. This river of money, originating in the dark tributaries of the city's underworld, flowed towards the house on Ocean Parkway, where its course was silently redirected. The loan shark's vigorish, the bookie's take, the kickback from a construction contract, all were part of a vast financial ecosystem that had its nexus in the mind of the man in the basement. This mechanism was elegant in its simplicity and staggering in its scope. The city's economic arteries were tapped at every critical junction. On the waterfront, the Gambino family's dominion was absolute. Not a single crate moved on the docks of Brooklyn or Manhattan without their sanction, a silent tax levied on the commerce of the world's busiest port. The profits from stolen cargo and smuggled goods were a foundational pillar of the empire. Further inland, the garment district was another fiefdom. Through control of the unions and trucking, the family dictated terms to manufacturers, settling labor disputes for a price and ensuring that non-compliant businesses found their shipments delayed or their factories strangely silent. The threads of the fashion industry were woven into the tapestry of organized crime, each strand leading back to the quiet house in Brooklyn. The city's very skeleton, its construction industry, was also under their sway. Union control meant the power to halt billion-dollar projects with a single unspoken command. It meant that contracts for concrete, for waste hauling, for labor itself were awarded to companies that understood the rules of the game. The skyline of New York was, in part, a monument to the influence that emanated from a single suburban home. This vast, illicit income required a sophisticated apparatus to cleanse it. The house on Ocean Parkway was not where money was washed, but where the laundering machine was designed and maintained. From his armchair, Gambino oversaw a sprawling portfolio of legitimate businesses that served as the empire's filtration system, turning dirty cash into taxable, respectable assets. Waste management companies were a particular stroke of genius. They were cash-heavy, difficult to audit, and provided an essential service, giving the family a legitimate foothold in every neighborhood and business district. These companies were not just fronts. They were instruments of intelligence and extortion, their roots a map of the city's vulnerabilities. A network of trucking firms, food distributors and restaurants performed a similar function. They absorbed the flow of cash from gambling and loan sharking operations, mingling it with legitimate receipts until its origins were indecipherable. These businesses were the public face of the empire, a chain of unremarkable storefronts that connected the underworld to the mainstream economy. The decisions to acquire these assets, to place a trusted associate at their head, were made in the soundproofed sanctity of the basement. It was a corporate strategy session for an enterprise whose business was crime. The goal was not just to clean the money, but to invest it, to grow the empire's legitimate holdings until the line between the criminal and the corporate blurred into non-existence. This financial architecture was protected by a web of corruption that extended into the city's official power structures. While Gambino himself avoided direct contact with politicians or high-ranking police officials, his influence was felt through intermediaries. A word to a union boss, a favor for a judge, a campaign contribution from a legitimate businessman. These were the subtle tools he used to ensure the system looked the other way. The house, therefore, operated as a node of immense gravity, bending the world around it. It was a place where the unwritten laws of the underworld were codified, and the official laws of the state were neutralized. This was achieved not through open defiance, but through quiet co-option, a slow, methodical infiltration of the institutions meant to uphold the law. The FBI knew. They watched the house relentlessly, their surveillance vans a familiar presence on the parkway. They photographed every man who came and went. They attempted to plant listening devices. They built extensive files. Yet they remained on the outside, looking in, unable to penetrate the fortress of silence that Gambino had constructed. He had built his defenses not with technology, but with human discipline. Important matters were never discussed on the telephone. No incriminating records were ever kept. The empire's history was purely an oral one, its secrets held in the minds of men bound by an oath of silence, an omerta enforced by the certainty of lethal punishment for betrayal. Inside this fortress, Gambino's control was absolute. He had created a self-contained universe with himself at its center, a world governed by his will alone. He rarely needed to leave the confines of his property. The mountain, in this case, always came to Muhammad. To be summoned to Ocean Parkway was the highest of honors and the most terrifying of obligations. The house became his psychological bunker, insulating him from the chaos and violence he orchestrated. The consequences of his decisions, the bodies left in the trunks of cars, the families ruined by debt, the businesses extorted into bankruptcy, were distant abstractions. Within the walls of his home, there was only order, discipline, and the quiet hum of a perfectly running machine. This insulation bred a profound sense of untouchability. He had solved the riddle that had destroyed so many of his predecessors, how to wield ultimate power without becoming its victim. He had made himself a ghost, a quiet force of nature, whose existence was felt everywhere but seen nowhere. The house was the physical embodiment of this achievement. Yet this perfect control came at the cost of deepening isolation. The windows of the house, which once looked out onto his domain, now served to keep the world at bay. He was a king who ruled from a self-imposed exile, his kingdom a vast network of whispers and shadows, his only true companions, the family who shared his gilded cage. The property was a stage, and on it, two plays ran simultaneously. Below ground, in the somber wood-paneled basement, the cold calculus of power and death held sway. It was a space of pure function, a corporate headquarters where the business of the empire was conducted with ruthless efficiency and without emotion. Above, in the sunlit rooms and the green backyard, the performance of domestic bliss was enacted. The smell of garlic and olive oil, the sound of grandchildren's laughter, the sight of neighbors waving from across the street. This was the theater of normality, a production so convincing that even those closest to its center could believe in its reality. The summer barbecues were the pinnacle of this duality. They were legendary gatherings, attended by the most powerful figures in the American Mafia. On the surface, they were relaxed, convivial affairs, a patriarch celebrating with his extended family and friends. The men drank homemade wine, played bocce on the lawn, and ate grilled sausages. But beneath the veneer of celebration, a complex political ritual was unfolding. Seating arrangements were signals of favor or displeasure. A private word with the boss by the rose bushes could seal a man's fortune or his fate. Alliances were tested, loyalties were gauged, and messages were sent and received in a language of gestures and inflections. These events were a demonstration of power in its most sophisticated form. Gambino was showing his men, and any watching federal agents, that his authority was so complete it required no overt display. He was not a gangster holding court. He was a grandfather at a family picnic. The performance was his ultimate defense. The house itself was a co-conspirator in this deception. Its very architecture, solid, respectable, utterly unremarkable, lent credibility to the charade. It was the perfect backdrop, a silent character whose presence reinforced the narrative of quiet, dignified retirement. The reign was at its zenith. The mechanism of the empire was invisible and seemingly flawless. Money flowed, enemies were silenced, and the authorities were kept at a frustrating distance. The house on Ocean Parkway stood as a monument to a power so absolute it had become indistinguishable from peace. It was a closed system, a perfect loop of crime, profit, and protection. The house was the control room, the point from which the entire sprawling enterprise was managed, with the serene confidence of a chess grandmaster who sees the entire board and is always 10 moves ahead. The silence that emanated from the property was not emptiness, it was the sound of total control. It was the quiet of a predator so dominant it no longer needed to roar. The neighborhood, the city, the very nation itself seemed to have been lulled by this placid facade. For nearly 2 decades the illusion held. The king sat on his suburban throne, believing his fortress to be impenetrable, his dynasty secure. The red brick walls seemed to promise permanence, a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. The system he had built was designed to withstand any external threat. It was a marvel of criminal engineering, a structure of loyalty and fear that seemed impervious to the forces of law and order. The world saw a house, the underworld saw a capital, the FBI saw a puzzle they could not solve. And Carlo Gambino, looking out from his window, saw an empire perfected, a kingdom built to last. The peak of power is often a place of great stillness, a plateau where the struggles of the climb are forgotten and the possibility of a fall seems unimaginable. The house at 2230 Ocean Parkway had reached this summit. It had become a symbol of a victory so complete that it felt like a law of nature. The quiet man in the quiet house was not just a boss, he was an institution, and his home was its temple. But no structure, whether built of brick or of fear, is immune to the pressures of time and the subtle, corrosive effects of human fallibility. The perfect machine had been built, but its continued operation depended entirely on the will of its creator. From this pinnacle of untouchable power, the only path leads downward. The rain felt eternal, the fortress impregnable, but the first hairline fractures, invisible to the naked eye, were already beginning to form in its deep foundations. No fortress stands forever. The laws of physics and the slow, grinding work of time guarantee that even the strongest stone will eventually yield. But the fortress at 2230 Ocean Parkway was built of something less tangible than stone. It was constructed from discipline, silence, and fear, materials that seemed immune to decay. The first cracks to appear in its foundations, therefore, were not caused by an external siege, but by the one force its master could not control, the inexorable passage of life itself. The initial fissure was biological. Carlo Gambino, the architect of this invisible empire, was growing old. The mind that held 1,000 secrets and balanced 100 competing interests remained sharp, but the body that housed it began to betray him. A failing heart is a potent metaphor, and in his case it was a literal one. The steady, powerful pulse that had driven the organization for 2 decades began to weaken, and with it the absolute certainty of his authority. Simultaneously, the world outside the fortress walls was changing. J. Edgar Hoover was gone, and the FBI, once fixated on the phantom of communism, was slowly awakening to the reality of a homegrown criminal confederacy. New laws were being forged in Washington. Tools like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, designed specifically to dismantle the kind of dynastic power structure that Gambino had perfected. The ground beneath the house was shifting. Inside the family, a new generation was coming of age. These were men who had not known the hardships of the Depression or the brutal street wars of Prohibition. They were born into the empire's prosperity, and they viewed its power not as something to be carefully guarded, but as a birthright to be flaunted. They lacked the old-world patience of their leader, their ambition sharpened by a distinctly American appetite for notoriety and material wealth. This generational divide manifested in the two men who stood as Gambino's most likely successors. They were not merely individuals, but living symbols of two possible futures for the family, two opposing philosophies of power. Their silent rivalry became the central fault line running directly beneath the house on Ocean Parkway. On one side was Agnello della Croce. Known as Mr. Neal, he was the underboss, a man of the old school, lean, feared, and fiercely loyal. He was a creature of the streets, the embodiment of the family's blue-collar muscle. He commanded the absolute respect of the soldiers, the earners, the men who did the dirty work that funded the empire's quiet existence. For them, he was the natural heir. On the other side was Gambino's own brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. Big Paul was a businessman, not a street boss. He operated from a mansion on Staten Island, overseeing the family's infiltration of legitimate industries. He saw the future not in extortion and gambling, but in union control and corporate boardrooms. He disdained the grimy work of the streets, viewing Della Croce and his followers as relics of a bygone era. The house on Ocean Parkway became the neutral ground where these two tectonic plates of the underworld met. Both men would visit the aging boss, bringing their reports and paying their respects, the air in the soundproofed basement thick with the unspoken question of succession. Gambino, the master manipulator, played them against each other, using their rivalry to maintain balance, unaware that he was priming a future explosion. The first operational cracks began to show. A high-profile kidnapping, a signature move of a crew looking for a quick score, drew intense and unwanted media and federal attention. It was a sloppy, flamboyant crime, the kind of move Gambino had spent his entire reign suppressing. It was a sign that his discipline was fraying at the edges, that the younger capos were beginning to test the limits of their autonomy. The response from the top was no longer as swift or as terrifying as it once had been. The quiet hand that had once guided every move was now occupied with matters of health and legacy. A sense of drift began to permeate the organization. Without the constant, invisible pressure from the center, standards slipped. Mistakes were made. Traces were left behind. As his physical world shrank to the confines of the house, it transformed from a command center into a gilded sick room. The fortress had become a cage. The man who once controlled a city was now engaged in a daily battle with his own mortality. His legendary walks through the neighborhood ceased, replaced by quiet afternoons in a chair facing the window, his gaze distant. Yet his mind remained fixed on the final problem, the one that had undone so many of his predecessors, securing the dynasty. He saw the fissures forming, the ambition in the eyes of his subordinates, the changing world outside his door. He believed that with one last act of strategic genius, he could secure his family's future for a generation, steering it away from the violence of the past and toward a more stable, corporate future. And so, from his deathbed, he made his decision. He bypassed tradition, bypassed the fearsome loyalty of Agnello della Croce. He named Paul Castellano as his chosen successor. It was a move intended to be visionary, an attempt to guide the family into the modern age of white-collar crime, to ensure its survival by making it legitimate. In the silent, wood-paneled rooms of the house, the decision was communicated. It was not a decree shouted from a balcony, but a whisper that carried the weight of an earthquake. It was a rejection of the family's very soul, an elevation of business over blood, of profit margins over the codes of the street. The news spread through the underworld, and a deep, resentful silence fell over Della Croce's faction. Their loyalty to the dying king was absolute. They would not challenge his final wish while he still drew breath. But a mortal wound had been inflicted upon the family's honor. The bond of trust that held the empire together had been broken. The house on Ocean Parkway, for so long a symbol of unity and absolute control, now became the origin point of a profound division. The choice made within its walls guaranteed that the empire would not survive its creator. It had fractured the very foundation of loyalty upon which it was built. The brick facade remained impassive, the lawn neatly trimmed. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The quiet house stood as it always had, a monument to suburban tranquility. But inside, the great machine of power had been set on a course for self-destruction. The king had made his final move, believing he was saving his kingdom. Instead, he had just signed its death warrant, ensuring that his own passing would be followed not by a smooth transition, but by a long and bloody civil war. The silence that fell over 2230 Ocean Parkway on October 15, 1976, was of a different quality. It was not the calculated heavy silence of a king on his throne, but the hollow, echoing silence of an empty one. The gravitational force that had bent the world around this modest brick house was gone, extinguished with the final beat of a failing heart. The fortress, for the first time in 2 decades, was just a house. For the federal agents who had spent years watching this address, it was a moment they had long anticipated. The house had been a symbol of their frustration, a quiet, suburban puzzle box they could not crack. Its master's death was not an end, but a beginning. It was the signal that the siege, long held at a frustrating distance, could finally commence. The invisible walls had fallen with their architect. The legal instrument for this invasion was a search warrant, a document that represented the culmination of years of patient surveillance and whispered informant testimony. It was not a warrant for a single crime, but for an enterprise, a legal broadsword designed to sever the head of a criminal hydra. It was the state's answer to the philosophy of silence, a loud official declaration that the reign was over. The operation began in the cold, pre-dawn darkness, a fleet of dark government sedans converging on a side street in Brooklyn. This was not a subtle tale, but a show of force. The sheer number of agents clad in windbreakers bearing the letters FBI was a stark counterpoint to the quiet, sleeping neighborhood. The human moat that had once protected this house was about to be breached by a federal tide. As the convoy moved down Ocean Parkway, the first light of dawn catching the windows of the surrounding homes, the world had been inverted. Neighbors, once the king's eyes and ears, now peered from behind curtains, bewildered spectators to a historic shift in power. The street, once an extension of the fortress's defenses, was now the staging ground for its violation. The moment of entry was not a dramatic splintering of wood. It was a firm, authoritative knock, followed by the presentation of the warrant. The front door, that sacred threshold between 2 worlds, was opened, and the spell of inviolability was broken. The mundane world, in the form of federal law enforcement, stepped inside, and the inner sanctum ceased to exist. Agents fanned out through the ground floor, their movements methodical and professional. The immediate impression was one of surreal contrast. The heavy, dark furniture, the family photographs on the mantel, the faint, lingering scent of cooked meals. It was the home of a patriarch, now being systematically dismantled by the very system he had so expertly subverted. In the living room, cushions were lifted, rugs were rolled back, and the contents of drawers were examined with quiet efficiency. They were searching for the tangible proof of an intangible empire: ledgers, contact lists, hidden cash. They found only the carefully curated props of a normal life, each family photo a silent testament to the genius of the deception. The search moved through the kitchen, a space that smelled of garlic and old-world tradition. Cabinet doors were opened, pantries were inspected, and the undersides of tables were felt for hidden compartments. The agents were not just looking for evidence, they were deconstructing an alibi, piece by piece, searching for the scene where the family man ended and the crime boss began. Upstairs, the private chambers were breached. This was the most intimate violation, the entry into the space where the king had slept, where he had spent his final fading days. Agents sifted through closets of austere, well-made suits and opened bedside tables looking for a hidden diary, a stray note, some final, human mistake. They found only the mundane possessions of an old man. One agent paused at the master bedroom window, the same pane of glass from which Gambino had observed his domain for years. He looked out not upon a kingdom of loyalists, but upon a perimeter of federal agents securing the street. The vantage point of the monarch was now occupied by the law, a perfect, symbolic reversal of power. Then came the descent. The primary objective of the raid lay below, in the subterranean heart of the fallen empire. The agents moved down the stairs to the basement, and with each step, the atmosphere seemed to grow colder, the air thicker with the weight of unspoken history. This was not a cellar. It was a tribunal, a boardroom, a confessional. The room was exactly as the informants had described it, paneled in dark wood, soundproofed, furnished with a simple table and several comfortable armchairs. It was a space designed for serious, secret work. The agents felt the ghost of power in the air, the residue of the thousands of decisions made between these walls, decisions that had shaped the fate of the city above. The search here was the most intense. Walls were tapped for hollow spaces, floorboards were examined for signs of disturbance, and every piece of furniture was inspected for hidden compartments. They were tearing apart the sanctum sanctorum, convinced that this was where the empire's secrets were physically stored. But they found nothing. No secret ledgers detailing decades of crime, no hidden caches of weapons or cash, no maps of territories or lists of corrupted officials. The room was clean, sterile. The throne, a simple armchair at the head of the table, was empty. The empire's archives had been kept in the one place they could never access, the mind of the man who had just died. It was a final, posthumous act of defiance, a testament to a discipline so absolute it extended beyond the grave. Gambino had left them a house, but not his secrets. The fortress was physically captured, but its intelligence, its soul, had vanished. The raid was a tactical success and a strategic failure. Yet the act itself was a form of justice. Though no incriminating evidence was found, the house was stripped of its power. Its aura of untouchability was shattered by the simple act of a federal agent crossing its threshold. It was no longer a fortress or a throne room. It was a crime scene, a piece of real estate subject to the laws of the land. As the agents filed out, their evidence bags tellingly empty, the media descended. Cameras and microphones transformed the quiet street into a chaotic stage. The house, once shielded by its anonymity, was now a public spectacle, its image broadcast across the nation as the captured nerve center of the American Mafia. The raid was the public punctuation mark on the end of an era. The power that had been centralized within those walls was now scattered, creating a vacuum that would ignite the succession crisis Gambino's final decision had already ordained. The house's fall was the prelude to the empire's bloody civil war. In the weeks that followed, the Gambino family quietly sold the property. The process of deliberate forgetting began. New owners would soon arrive, bringing with them new paint, new furniture, and a new life for the structure, burying the dark history under fresh layers of suburban normality. The agents left Ocean Parkway with a profound understanding. The power had never resided in the bricks or the mortar, in the soundproofed walls or the deep foundations. It had resided in the will of a single man. When that will was extinguished, the fortress became a shell, a hollow monument to a vanished kingdom. And so the house was conquered, but did that mean justice had won? Does true power lie in what is built with concrete and steel, a structure that can be raided and seized? Or is it something more elusive, something that survives the fall, a legacy of fear and influence that lingers long after the walls have been breached? If you believe the fall of a symbol is as important as the fall of a man, subscribe to witness more stories where architecture itself stands trial. The wind that blows down Ocean Parkway today carries no memory. It rustles the same leaves on the same sycamore trees, but the secrets it once seemed to whisper have gone. The house at 2230 stands not as a ruin of crumbling brick, but as a ruin of purpose. Its walls are solid, its windows are clean, and its silence is no longer the calculated quiet of a predator, but the simple, hollow silence of an empty stage. The performance is over, the audience has gone home, and the fortress is once again just a house. It has become an expert in the art of forgetting, a skill inherited from its former master. New layers of paint cover the original plaster, sealing in the ghosts of old conspiracies. New families have lived within its rooms. their laughter and arguments creating a fresh history that slowly suffocates the old one. The structure itself seems to have accepted its new identity with a quiet, stoic complicity, offering no resistance to its own historical erasure. The king is in another fortress now, a private mausoleum of cold stone in a queen's cemetery. Carlo Gambino achieved what no other of his stature had. He won his personal war, dying a free man in his own bed. He beat the law, he outlived his enemies, and he escaped the violent end that was the birthright of his profession. Yet this personal victory was paid for with the soul of his empire. His final act, conceived within the insulated quiet of the house, was to name a successor who understood business but not the street. In choosing Paul Castellano, he sought to steer his dynasty toward a future of corporate legitimacy, but instead he fractured its very foundation. The decision was a fatal miscalculation, proving that even the most brilliant strategist cannot command the future from beyond the grave. The chaos that followed was a direct repudiation of every principle the house on Ocean Parkway represented. The rise of John Gotti, the dapper Don, replaced the empire of silence with a carnival of noise. The media spectacle, the public trials, the brazen defiance. It was the loud, spectacular implosion of a world built on discretion, a firestorm ignited by the spark of Gambino's final, flawed decision. Throughout this slow public unraveling, the house remained a silent, brick-faced ghost of a more disciplined age. It stood as a monument to a lost philosophy, its quiet suburban dignity a stark contrast to the flamboyant self-destruction of the organization it once commanded. It became an architectural relic of a more terrifying and ultimately more effective form of power. Today, its value is measured not in fear and influence, but in the mundane language of the market. Square footage, property taxes, comparable sales in the neighborhood. Its transformation from an epicenter of underworld authority to a simple piece of real estate is the final, quietest defeat. Power has been rendered into equity, a throne appraised and sold to the highest bidder. The human moat that once surrounded it has long since drained away. The loyal cousins and watchful capos have been replaced by new neighbors who know nothing of the gravity this address once held. The web of eyes and ears has dissolved, leaving only a community of strangers. The fortress was never the house itself, but the network projected onto it, and that network is gone. We return, then, to where the story began, to a solid, unpretentious structure of red brick that offers no clues. The most profound evidence of the empire that was is the seamlessness of its erasure from this physical place. The greatest ruin is not one of decay, but of this perfect, unsettling normality. The house stands as a final, haunting paradox, a monument to an invisible empire, now made invisible itself. It is the physical proof that a structure built entirely on the will of one man, no matter how powerful, cannot outlast him. The foundations were not concrete and steel, but fear and loyalty, and these materials are biodegradable. Its quiet facade forces a final, unsettling question. Was the power ever truly in the house, in the land, in the very mortar between the bricks? Or was it always an illusion, a collective belief that simply evaporated when its architect was no longer there to sustain it, leaving nothing behind but an ordinary home on an ordinary street? What truly remains when an empire of shadows collapses? Not stone, not gold, but a story, and the unsettling quiet of a house that has learned to forget its king. If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.